I think that compassion is really one of the dude's great moral qualities, and it's linked to this kind of moral insight of being able to see what is good about people, even when, in fact, they are seriously flawed.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a more knowledgeable life, a happy life. And today we have philosophy professor and poet Troy Jollimore. He co-wrote an essay on the Big Lebowski. And the essay is That Ain't Legal Either. Rules, Virtue, and Authenticity in the Big Lebowski. And we love film. We love being philosophical about film. We love breaking things down, using our critical thinking skills and figuring out what is the deeper meaning, what is happening here. Rudy, you're a big fan of the Big Lebowski. What did you get out of this episode with Troy?
Both his essay and our discussion made me fall even more deeply in love with the dude. Mm-hmm. And if you know who I'm referring, if you know the Big Lebowski, you know who I'm talking about. I mean, I always had this admiration for the dude. And yes, of course, there's always this little part of you that's kind of like laughing at the dude because you're thinking, oh, what a loser. Or, oh, God, look at this guy. What a moron. But no, the dude is one of the most down-to-earth, happiest, joyful, loving of life individuals on earth. In reading the essay and reading how the dude really is a protagonist and accepts everybody for who they are, not judgmental, morally on a straight line, it makes me fall in line to think that the dude could be one of the greatest heroes in modern film. And I mean that. I know that's crazy talk, but in this psychotic day and age that we live in, where we're not sure what's real, we're not sure who is real, we're not sure if we're being lied to, we're not sure of anything politically or anything, we need more people like the dude. Mm-hmm. That's what I got out of this episode.
Yeah, and I think even at the beginning, discussing the phenomenon of game and sportsmanship and what that tells us about humanity and fairness and authenticity. We get all of that in our discussion with Troy, which is just delightful because one of the reasons why we enjoy these characters or enjoy the films, there's not just this entertainment level, but there is a deeper level that's speaking to us about how we interact and what we think is right and wrong in the world. And so we get all of that when we're talking about the Big Lebowski. Okay. Oh, wait, I got to tell our listeners, Good is in the Details is up for Women in Podcasting Award in the education category. We need your vote. For those of you who voted, thank you so much. I'm going to link it in the show notes, womeninpodcasting.net, and go to the education category to vote for Good is in the Details. Okay, and now we're going to be talking about virtue and the dude. Rudy, do you have a favorite Coen Brothers film?
I do. It is The Big Lebowski, which we will discuss the reasons why. There are a lot of personal reasons why, but there's a lot of Coen Brother films that you can just watch and rewatch. It really it depends on the mood. I think, Troy, you'd agree with me. The Coen Brothers are big fans of film noir. Dare I say, most of their films are and would fit into the neo-noir kind of, construct of if you're studying film and if you understand the differences between classical film noir and, post-noir, the Coen Brothers have their own unique brand of noir. So I love all Coen Brother films, but The Big Lebowski is the one that I can watch on repeat. I'm not the only person that can watch them on repeat. I do find that a lot of the Coen Brother films, you watch them and you have to take a break from them for a little while because they have to sit, they have to marinate in your brain depending upon where you are in your life or what's going on in your life. The movie might mean one thing and then another and then another. Like, for example, who the hell is watching No Country for Old Men on repeat? I mean, I'd like to meet the psychopath that can watch that movie because I have to wait at least 5 years in between watching that because I feel so disturbed. But The Big Lebowski, it can be on repeat. In addition to the fact that there's a lot of bowling in it, and we'll talk about the fact that like the only sport that I did growing up was bowling.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, at one point in my life, it's kind of a funny story. Like I actually went out bowling so Gwen and I went to she went to the all-girl school. I went to the all-guy school.
Uh-huh.
And at these schools, the football players dominated the popularity. They pretty much ran the entire school. So I never met any of the girls at Gwen's school, really didn't get to know them. And then the first weekend of sophomore year, a friend said, hey, we're going to go out bowling with a bunch of girls from Rosary. And I thought, that's it. This is the night where I'm finally going to get a date, where I'm finally going to meet a girl. We went out to that place in Anaheim. Gwen, remember the place that was right by that golf and stuff place? It was
Yeah,
concourse or
yeah.
something. And there was a whole group of girls from Gwen's class, and I was like giving bowling tips, and I was like showing off. And then like at the end of the night, I was smiling, and I kind of heard like a couple of the girls say, "What a loser!"
Oh, no.
Literally the next day, I quit bowling, and I didn't bowl for a decade.
Oh,
And at that point, I was like dominating in Southern California. I was starting to win tournaments, and I was like,
oh my
okay, like
God.
I can really like become a professional bowler if I wanted to. That night, because of girls at Rosary High School,
Throwing shade.
some
Throwing
people.
shade to the football players and the girls. Poor
Oh
Tony
yeah,
McCann.
absolutely.
He's going to be
I
hearing
never
this.
forget anything. Some people say it was the greatest thing that happened to me. Dare I say, I don't know what my life would have been like had that night not happened. So going back, I love all films with bowling, right? I love Kingpin. I love,
Right.
There's even some references to Just One of the Guys, but The Big Lebowski is the king of bowling films.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts as we get into it. I mean, you definitely mentioned the game of bowling a bit in your paper, but what is it about bowling that you can tie to philosophy if you can do it?
Great. Okay, no, good. That's wonderful. We can definitely talk about that. I love it. There is, first of all, the fact that bowling is a game, and I think all games are philosophically interesting and in ways that are worth discussing. And then there are the particularities of bowling itself. So start with the first point, and I can be pretty brief on this, but games in the last few years have gotten some significant philosophical interest, partly because of this book by this guy Bernard Suits called The Grasshopper that came out some years ago, and has become more and more well known as time has gone on. And it turns out they're very interesting. Part of the interest of games for philosophers, of course, is that in Ludwig Wittgenstein's work, in his philosophical investigations, he uses games as an example of a term that can't be defined in the way that philosophers think we can define terms. And so he's trying to undermine these standard philosophy paradigms of how language works and how thought works. And he says philosophers, starting with Plato, have this idea of how you define a term. You give these necessary and sufficient conditions and so on. And you can't do that with games, because any definition of game that you offer, somebody can come up with a counterexample, something that's a game, but it doesn't fit that definition. And so game is what he calls a family resemblance concept, right? So there's all this literature about that. And Bernard Suits, partly what he's doing in this book is challenging Wittgenstein on this and coming up with a definition of game which he thinks does provide necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, it probably doesn't actually work, but I'm not going to get into the weeds of that. But it's a pretty good attempt, and it tells us some interesting things about games. And part of what I think is most interesting about Suits's work is some of the stuff he says about the way that a game, and again, maybe there are a few exceptions to this, but I'm not going to worry about that, but a standard game, certainly something like bowling, is a case where we adopt a kind of goal or end, and we deliberately choose to follow rules that makes it hard for us to achieve that goal, because that's where the game really comes in. Because the point of bowling, is to knock down the pins, but obviously knocking down the pins would be easy if it weren't for the rules. If I didn't have to use the ball and I could just walk up to them and knock them over as swiping my hand, or even if I took the ball, and I walked down the alley and stood right there and used the ball to knock them down one by one, there's nothing easier than knocking down pins. But we make it deliberately hard for ourselves. And that's how it becomes a game. And this is a very interesting sort of thing, because, of course, normally in life, we're trying to make things easier for ourselves. This looks like, sort of from a certain perspective, irrational behavior. Normally, you've got your goals, and you try to figure out how to accomplish those goals with as little trouble and as little effort as possible. You make it easy on yourself so that you can save that energy and effort and so on for elsewhere. You don't make things deliberately hard. Why would anybody do that? Well, in a game, you deliberately do that. You make things harder. In golf, you have to get the ball into the hole, but you have to do it by starting way back and just hitting it with a stick, and there's all these rules about how you can do this and so on. So why would anybody do that? Well, because in some way it's fun, right? Well, why is it fun? Where does the pleasure come from in that? And I think that's a great question a lot of people really thought about, but it does seem in some way to give us a sense of purpose. And here maybe we're getting to, I think, some of the things that are going on in The Big Lebowski, that if we think of absurdity as a threat to our lives, as the threat of nihilism, or the threat of, that life is meaningless and really means nothing. Games, and this is one of Suits' thoughts I think that he's exploring, playing a game can be a way of making your life at least seem to be meaningful, or making an activity that seems to have meaning. And it works in this very odd way again, which is you take a goal which really in itself has no value or has no meaning. It doesn't matter whether the pins are lying horizontal, or if they're up stacked vertically or whatever, who cares, right? But you invest it with a kind of meaning, and then you pursue that goal. Again, according to certain rules, which actually makes it hard to bring about that outcome. And the game then becomes a test of skill in some way. And if you enjoy it, which clearly the characters in this film enjoy bowling, it becomes fun and it gives you pleasure. So the innocuous appearing concept of games raises all of these questions about meaning in life and about nihilism. And what is it that we do in life that actually has meaning? At the end of the day, is it the case that all of our activities in life are really essentially like games? That everything is something that really has no meaning in itself, but we choose to make it have meaning and then we pursue it. And now we have something, we feel like there's meaning for us in life. It's like what Harry Frankfurt, who was my advisor in grad school, said about final ends, that we think of final ends as being things that, they have importance in themselves, and so we choose means to attain them. But in fact, final ends also are a kind of means, because they're very useful too. What they're useful for is giving our lives meaning. If you have final ends in life, you have something to do. You get up in the morning, you have something to pursue. You have goals. So games can give us goals in a way. And so maybe, I think one of the things that this film is playing with at a deep level, and again, it rarely makes it overt, right? Because on the surface, this film is such a playful, humorous film. But I think at the deep level, it's playing with these very deep questions about meaning in life and what has meaning. And it's asking whether everything in life perhaps is just a game. And if not, how do we distinguish the activities in life that are games from the activities in life that are somehow not games? You might recall at a certain point in the film when Bunny appears to have been kidnapped, and then the dude suggests the idea that Bunny actually has simply kidnapped herself or something like that. Walter takes this on, and he's immediately just completely convinced. He knows this is what has happened. And he said, don't you see? Yeah, it's all a game, right? And suddenly this kidnapping thing, which has seemed to be a very serious thing in life, has now become for Walter just another kind of bowling. It's a game for him. And the question is, how are we going to play this game well, and how are we going to win it?
And we'll get to the Walter jumping on the idea and his rigidity in a second. But do you think the fact that, just going back to bowling for a second, that many people laugh at the fact that bowling is quote unquote a sport, even though every Sunday morning when I'm working out, I'm watching the PBA on ESPN, so clearly it's a sport. Do you think the fact that, bowling's kind of a funny, kind of a ha-ha sport, that's why it was used? Do you think there's an element of that because of the dude and everything? It kind of matches into, well, what is a game? What is life? What is meaning? Okay, let's focus on bowling. Do you think that was purposeful?
Yeah, I do. I think that certainly they see bowling as that is the Coen brothers, see bowling as in some way inherently comical. And we see that in the sort of opening montage of all the people bowling as the credits for the film are playing. It's a very funny sequence. And it's interesting to ask what's funny about it, because it's just a bunch of people bowling. But the way they're filmed really brings out, it's like a silent movie sequence in a way. It really brings out the physical comedy, which is rooted in kind of the physical absurdity of these movements, which I think is connected to this fact you're bringing up.
Masterful sportsmanship? Is that what you said? I'm sorry. Yes.
Well,
Okay.
yes,
Just wanted to correct you there.
There we go. There we go.
I would agree with that. I mean, look, I'm going to make the following claim. Any sport, really, if you sort of isolate it and you just watch an athlete in weird isolation out of the context, is going to look really weird and awkward and bizarre. The things they're doing with their bodies are just weird. And yet, in context or watched in the right perspective, what you see is this incredible display of skill. Sports are just weird, right? And we forget that because they're so familiar to us. But if you sort of withdraw, I mean, I remember an afternoon I spent with my grandmother not too long before she died, where we sat and we watched a cricket game, and neither of us knew anything about cricket and had no idea how it worked. And it was so strange. We could not figure it out. It was such a weird thing to watch because we weren't coming from the informed perspective. So I think that any sport really is like that. And really, in a way, any human activity is like this. If you watch it out of context from an alienist perspective, you kind of see, oh yeah, this is really weird.
And it's perfect that we're recording this episode right in the middle of the Olympics, right? Because the world right now is watching, glued to the TV. The ratings are through the roof. And I bet you there's a good portion of people going, how the hell is that a sport in the Olympics, right? It's like, it's almost perfect perfect. Like the timing of this episode is terrific. I like to timestamp some things because when we record and some of the things that we do, it's interesting to go back on. You
Yeah.
brought up Walter and his seizing on the dude's kind of half-assed, like, she probably kidnapped herself. And then you raised that aspect of Walter and what he's supposed to represent in your excellent essay, by the way. And what you did was you kind of slotted Walter in this unmovable rigidity. And that's Walter's problem, right? And you kind of contrast Walter versus the nihilists. And you use the example of how once Walter gets his mind on something, you cannot change it. Like, for example, the stealing of the car. And there's just a lot of examples of that. But here's always kind of been my issue with the Big Lebowski. And in reading your essay, it just focuses it even more on me. Everybody loves Walter. They just do. Walter is the comic relief of the film. Yet I read your essay, Troy, and really, I'm sorry. Now I'm thinking Walter's one of the bad guys. And obviously, if you watch the movie and it's like, yeah, Walter's doing all kinds of dumb shit. But it's really interesting reading your essay and the way that you're painting Walter. Can you expound upon like my thinking that Walter is also one of the villains here? Or is it just that, hey, look, no, he's not a villain. We all have circle of friends. We all have people that have certain personality disorders. Walter just happens to have one of them. And for some reason, everybody gravitated and fell in love with Walter. But should we feel bad about loving Walter?
What a great question. And I think there's so much to say about this, so I'll try to keep it under control. But it does really provide an entry into some of the central, what I think this film is really about, if we have to say it's really about anything. And that is about love and friendship. Of course, I do philosophy of love and friendship, so I see everything as being really about that. So that's just a bias of mine. But I think it's true. First of all, quick answer to your question. Would I love Walter in real life? No, I would think he was quite frightening, and I don't think I would. I think I would mostly just avoid him and not like him very much. Do I love him as a movie character? Yeah, because that's a different sort of thing. The distancing of watching a movie and knowing that he's safely on the screen where he can't actually do any harm that will actually come back to me allows me to see something which I think the dude in the fictional universe of the film is able to see. And this is really part of the dude's great wisdom and why he is even though the dude himself is flawed. He's not perfect, and I think that's important. But he is sort of above most of the people in the film, I think, in terms of moral insight and moral wisdom. And one of his great pieces of moral wisdom, and he's so Aristotelian, I think, in this way, he is able to see Walter as a fundamentally good, decent person despite his flaws. And in fact, he goes further than that. He does something, and this is something I'm writing about right now. There are these people called the moral particularists. They're very skeptical about the idea of absolute rules in morality. They think that perhaps all rules have exceptions, or really rules aren't even important. You have to judge situations by case basis and so on. Lots of complexities here I'm not going to get into, but they often talk about moral experience and the significance of a particular sort of fact as something that can flip given the context. So something that is good most of the time can actually turn and be bad in a slightly different context. And so an example might be pleasure, where most of the time, Jonathan Dancy gives this as an example somewhere, most of the time the fact that something would give somebody pleasure would be a reason for doing it. But the fact that suppose there's this kid around who my kid doesn't like, and if I beat up that kid, it would give my kid pleasure because he'd watch this other kid get beat up. That's not a reason for doing it. That's actually even more of a reason for not doing it, because it would be sadistic and cruel in that case and would feed my child's sadistic, cruel impulses. So the particularist idea, we can call that kind of flipping in a way, right? The valence of something which ordinarily has a positive valence gets flipped. I think that the dude does something like this with Walter. He sees that things that are flaws, and certainly appear to be flaws to most people, they're also sort of on the verge of being virtues. Like there's something admirable about them. So Walter is this really rigid guy, and that's a problem. It's a flaw. But it also means he's a very moral person, in a sense. He's on the verge of being right. He just takes it too far. Walter gets very angry, and he flies out of control at trivial things in response to trivial slights and so on. But of course, he generally does it because he thinks somebody has insulted his friends, or he's defending them in some way. You know, that Jesus or whatever has insulted and sort of threatened vaguely his friends, and he gets very angry in response, right? Whatever the nihilists, he fights them, and he sort of loses it again. He's not in control, but there's an admirable impulse at the heart of it, which which is, again, to protect the innocent. I mean, Walter is very fixated on, very motivated by the desire to protect innocent people, and this is very admirable. And this is something I didn't really get at, or we didn't, because the paper was co-authored, right? But we didn't get at in that paper. We stressed Walter's flaws, which I think are very real. But I found myself more and more thinking about the dude's ability to see that those flaws are actually closely linked to virtues. I think part of the reason we, the audience, love Walter is that we do see him as this really good, really loyal, committed friend who, yes, has poor judgment and takes it too far. But wouldn't you, in a way, want to have a friend like Walter? There's something about that actually, at the end, after he screws up and he empties the can of ashes and they fly in the dude's face and so on, they embrace and the dude forgives him. He knows that all this was motivated by Walter's love for Donnie and his love for the dude. He sees this good person at the heart of Walter. And honestly, I think the dude, we can extend that to other people, in the confrontation with, I never know what to call him. His name's Jeffrey Lebowski, right? The really rich guy, the guy in the wheelchair. Maybe we can call him JL.
You refer to him as the Big Lebowski in your paper.
And I now regret that. So maybe I want to come back to that. My friend Peter Fossil, who I mentioned, has actually convinced me that he shouldn't be considered the Big Lebowski either. But Peter's claim, by the way, if we can talk more of this if you want, is that Bunny Lebowski should be considered the Big Lebowski. I think it's a very interesting claim. So, but let me, for the moment, refer to the wealthy guy who isn't really even wealthy at all, right? He's a total sham. The guy in the wheelchair is JL. In the confrontation with him, of course, Walter again loses it, and he picks him up because he's convinced that he's faking his disability, which he's not. And he falls to the floor and starts to cry. And the dude has compassion for him. And I think the dude even sees this guy who has been manipulating him and intended to exploit and use him. He even sees him as this flawed human being who's sort of been reduced to the status of a helpless child. And I think he feels genuine compassion for him. So I think that compassion is really one of the dude's great moral qualities. And it's linked to this kind of moral insight of being able to see what is good about people, even when, in fact, they are seriously flawed.
Can we go back to that scene with the ashes? Because whenever I think of the Big Lebowski, that is what comes to my mind. It seems to go to this idea of absurdity because it really is. Well, let me just ask, why is it funny? Because it's like, I think it's just that it's so shocking, but it's so funny at the same time. Like, what is going on in that scene? That moment just is, I mean, it's like you're laughing kind of out of horror, but understanding. And it just seems to encapsulate this idea of the absurd human condition, this idea of trying to find meaning and things don't go the way that they should and they go completely wrong. But why is it that we are all laughing at that?
Let me point out one or two thoughts that I think these are the obvious reasons, right? And then you, the smart philosophers, can figure out, can explain the non-obvious because you guys are way smarter than me. One of the very first reasons is because it's in a coffee can, right? They're being cheap, right? And human beings are inherently, they're cheap. I mean, how much is the urn? What? It's just an urn full of ashes? That's ridiculous. Let's just go get a coffee can. Number one. Number two, the positioning. I mean, where you dump ashes, I mean, you got to be aware of the wind, right? Like you're so arrogant that you don't even,
so absurd.
You're never thinking of the consequences of your actions. It's as simple as you didn't even think about opening up a coffee can full of ashes where there would be wind. And so it kind of like really points out the lack of thinking, I think. That might be one reason.
And it wasn't offensive. I mean, that's the thing, is that normally we would imagine some sort of a burial ceremony or when somebody dies is like this extremely solemn moment. And so that curveball that makes us all laugh so hard is just an interesting balance of maybe like when we're confronted with the reality of our own mortality and like what happens to us after we die. It was allowing us to laugh, I think, when it seems so serious. But Troy, what say you?
Oh, I very much agree with what you're saying here, with all of what you've just said. And yeah, start with that last point, the being literally faced with our own mortality. I mean, the dude here literally has mortality thrown in his face at the end of this very silly movie where we're feeling most of the time like nothing really bad is ever going to happen because it's a comedy. This beloved character dies and he's reduced to ashes. And then even the little funeral ceremony goes sort of horribly wrong. But it's not horrible because it's these guys and it's so filled with love, that there is a sense in which it doesn't matter. I mean, not that it doesn't matter, that's not the right phrase, but it's not tragic or it's not awful. The tragedy is in his death, and he's dead regardless of what has happened to the ashes. My sense of Donnie is that if he was there, he would laugh at this. He would not be offended. He doesn't seem like the kind of guy with that sort of self-regarding gravitas that would take this seriously and think, oh, what a terrible way that they're treating my body. So, of course, it's set up and shot as a comic scene, right? We laugh, yes, because of the coffee can. And maybe there's more to say about that coffee can. We laugh because of just the visual of when the dust blows away and we see the dude with the ashes on his face and the look on his face. The whole thing is just, it's a perfect little shot. We have to laugh, just, visually speaking. Again, a perfect sort of silent movie moment. And then Walter's reaction when he does realize that what he has done, because like you said, he was just giving no thought to the consequences. And this, again, is very much in Walter's character. This whole scene is such a perfect expression of the characters of the three of them, including Donnie. Walter is this sentimentalist who has these grand ideas of how something will go, and this will be so moving as he gives his little speech and he empties the ashes, and of course they'll blow out to sea, because that's how it would happen in the movies, right? But, this isn't a movie. Well, except it is a movie, right? And that's something the Coens are doing. They're very clever here. But what if things in a movie happen the way they would in real life? In real life, the wind's going to blow whatever way it blows. Probably, if you're on the beach, it's going to blow from the ocean onto land. Walter doesn't consider that because he lives in this sort of fantasy world, this world based in his Vietnam experiences and this image of himself that he's constructed. And so he just assumes it'll go the way he wants it to go. And then he's faced with reality. I also think that thing, like you said, about being faced with mortality is so important. Even the scene that precedes that, where they go and get the coffee can, where they're in the mortuary, and there's something absurd about the ostentation of this place and this terrible funeral director who takes it so seriously. I mean, it is serious, it's death. But the funeral director's idea of how to recognize the seriousness of death is a very wrong-headed idea, which is you do it with money. It's the same idea that's shared by most of the characters that surround him in this movie. And it's something that the dude just rejects at the base level. The dude is not ostentatious. The dude doesn't think about his own self-presentation. He doesn't have an image that he's cultivating for people. He doesn't own a lot of things that he uses to try to impress people. The things that he owns that he cares about are just for him because they give him pleasure. He cares about his car, even though it's a really shitty car. He cares about his rug because it ties the room together, right? He cares about his bowling ball because he needs it to bowl. He cares about his credence tapes in the car. What else does he really care about by way of material possessions? There really isn't much. And even the rug, we should say, if we're talking about the dude's non-attachment, he cares about the rug because it ties the room together. And he says at one point, all the dude ever cared about, all the dude ever wanted was to get his rug back. But of course, he accepts a replacement rug, and he's fine with that. He takes a rug from JL's, the rich guy's house, and he seems perfectly content with the replacement rug. So the dude really doesn't get attached to physical things. And for me, it's very much in character for the dude to say, you know what, any receptacle will do. We just need to carry the ashes. We don't need to pay this guy a whole, hundreds of dollars for some special thing for Donnie's ashes. Donnie wouldn't have done that. And none of us should do that. Who really cares? Who's going to be watching? Who's going to be impressed by the amount of money we spend on the receptacle for Donnie's ashes? A Folgers coffee can will do just as well.
I would have loved to have been in the writer's room for that one. Like, who came up with that idea? Well, back to this idea about games, something else that I think is really interesting that comes through in your essay is that games, while they might seem absurd, this activity and it has rules and why do we do it? What is the meaning? But it also reveals a sense of justice. And we can even see that with the Olympics going on right now, that the way that somebody plays a game, the way that they respond, the way that they train is also indicative of somebody's character. So this like little absurd thing that doesn't really have any value unless we attach it to it, but it reveals something that we do value, namely the way that somebody plays. Or if somebody cheats in a game, this absurd thing, we take that as their revelation of what kind of a person that they are.
That's really true, and it's interesting, isn't it? And certainly some of the deep differences between the dude's character and Walter's. And again, I'm so interested in this because I'm so fascinated by their friendship and the fact that they managed to build this very committed, affectionate friendship on the basis of two people who just seem so radically different in so many ways. Some of those differences are really revealed in their conduct in the bowling alley. That's where we see their true characters in a lot of ways. So the of course, famous moment when Smokey goes over the line with his toe, or at least allegedly does. I don't think we ever see it, so we don't really know whether he does or not. But Walter is convinced that he has. And so Walter, as usual, when he believes something, the only way Walter knows how to believe anything is with absolute certainty, right? There's no sort of, cautious or conditional personal belief for Walter. It's just, that's true, it's completely true. I'm never going to consider changing it, and that's that. He believes with absolute certainty that Smokey's toe has gone over the line, and therefore he has cheated, even though Smokey, of course, is the nicest guy in the world and would never intentionally cheat. And he pulls his gun on him, and he's going to enforce those rules. So this again goes back to that rule rigidity, that Walter is unable to perceive the very important difference between rules in an arbitrary game and moral rules in real life. And so he doesn't see that even if it were true that the toe had gone over the line, it wouldn't really matter that much. It wouldn't really justify pulling a gun and threatening to shoot somebody and end their life. That's just a kind of insane reaction. And the dude, of course, as somebody who in my view is much closer to manifesting true Aristotelian virtue, has good judgment and is able to say, hey, this is only just a game, which I believe he actually says to Walter, it's just a game, man. Relax, it's not so important, it doesn't matter. So the dude has this perspective, a sense of larger perspective. He's able to play, as committed as he is to bowling, how much he loves bowling. And he does. And he loves his friends who he bowls with, and he wants to bowl well for them so that they can win. And he is reliable, he turns up when he's supposed to. All of that is true, and yet he's completely capable of saying, hey, it's not worth it, it's still only a game, it doesn't matter that much. Or, hey, this woman's life may be in danger, we have to take that seriously, that has to take priority, and so on. He has this sense of larger perspective that Walter just doesn't seem to have.
I see that one of the things you wrote about the dude is that he shows no desire to dominate or to exclude, and the way he's able to move in and out of various circles. When you say that he's virtuous, what is the moral standing or the moral lesson that we get from the way that he is? Or maybe even these undude characteristics that he's against inauthenticity, hypocrisy, and exclusion.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about that. And I want to be careful because, so in that paper, Robert and I wrote it, and my friend Robert Jones, from whom I've learned so much about the Coens, and we discussed them so much over the years, we sort of take a single, we interpret the film as if, well, clearly it's saying this. And of course, a film is always much more interesting than that. It's somewhat ambiguous. But I think it's reasonable to see the dude. It is, to me, at least a very plausible reading of the film, to experience it as showing him somebody who we are meant to admire in many ways and be fond of, even as he himself has his foibles and his flaws, etc. So I don't want to certainly hold him up as a paragon exact, but the more I've thought about the dude over the years, because the first time I watched the film, like many people, I didn't like it that much. And I thought he was kind of a ridiculous person. And I thought, well, the Coens are kind of mocking him and they don't really like him very much. He's absurd. As I've watched the film over the years, it's become very apparent that they love this guy. And that's not inconsistent with saying that he has some flaws, because everybody's imperfect. That's one of the things that I think makes them great as filmmakers. They realize that everyone is imperfect, and the dude certainly is. Nonetheless, he's very admirable in certain ways. And some of it, I think, relates to what I was saying about, again, his lack of ostentation. And that relates to authenticity, which you just mentioned, that unlike so many of the people around the dude, including the rich Jeffrey Lebowski, again, so being the prime example, but also the nihilists, who are very concerned about how people see them, and they want to be seen as scary, frightening. We're nihilists, we believe in nothing, they say. And of course, it's just a pose. They're actually not very scary at all, and they do believe in things, and they whine, in fact, when things go against them and don't go their way. It's a pose. The wealthy Lebowski's being is a pose. He's not actually wealthy. He hasn't really achieved much of anything. We discover this, right, as the film goes on. He's like the man behind the curtain in Wizard of Oz. You realize there's really nothing there when the truth is revealed, right? There's just this small man behind a desk. There's nothing. The dude is so different. It's not that he's not self-aware. I think the dude knows quite well who he is, but he doesn't seem to go to great efforts to communicate that to other people. When he leaves the house, for instance, he doesn't change how he's dressed. He just walks out exactly the way he is in his own home, which is very casual, to say the least. One of my friends, I watched it with a bunch of friends some years ago, and one of them commented on Jeff Bridges' performance and said, it's this really amazing performance where he seems so comfortable all the time. And when he sits down somewhere, he completely makes himself comfortable, including sort of sinking into the chair and kind of thrusting his groin forward. And it's true when you watch it, he does this a lot. There's no sense of vulnerability in a way, except a very sort of, I think, attractive sense of emotional vulnerability. Like the dude is very open to the world, but there's very little fear. He seems to accept himself and not really care too much whether other people accept him or not. So when he goes to meet the wealthy Lebowski, and he's dressed as he usually is, and the wealthy Lebowski says, do you go out looking for a job dressed like this? And the dude says, I don't even know what day it is, basically. Like, he starts insulting him, and he just doesn't care. He just laughs it off. He shrugs, oh, whatever, you think what you think, you're a square, I don't really care what you think. And that seems to be in large part his general attitude towards the world. There's a real confidence, and it comes from what I take to be a real sense of authenticity, of having some time ago come to really accept himself on a deep level. And it is linked to this very interesting openness. Well, for instance, take the fact that his house is just essentially a place that people enter and leave as they wish. Like the door barely, there's not much point in him even having a door, right? And this is not something the dude is completely happy about, because of course, as the film goes on, his house gets invaded over and over, and it becomes a problem for him. But I think it's very emblematic of the dude's openness and this sort of democratic impulse in a way that when people want to go into his home, they just walk in. If they want to go into his bathroom while he's taking a bath, they just walk in. They walk in and they take stuff, they walk in and they break stuff, they walk in and they assault him, they walk in while he's not there and trash the place while searching it and so on. They treat his property like it's not really private property at all. This strikes me as funny because, of course, in the first scene, when the two thugs are already in the house, they're in there even before he is, he says, hey, this is a private residence, man. Like as if it was just a misunderstanding, like they wandered in not realizing it was somebody's home, which I think is hilarious. And then, of course, towards the end with the confrontation with the nihilists, Walter, as you would expect, insists on the rights of private property, right? When the nihilists are saying, we'll just take what you have on you and we'll call it even, which is like $22. It's practically nothing. Donnie and the dude, of course, are happy to do that. They're getting off cheap. And Walter, it's the rule. It's the principle of the thing. He says, no, this is my private property. You're not taking it. So here again is a strong difference between Walter and the dude. Private property, I think, with the exception of these very rare things he's attached to, means very little to him. And like I said, even those things he's attached to, he's often willing to accept a replacement, the rug being, one of the prime examples.
Troy, it's interesting going back to the Coen Brothers and their films. Coen Brothers in particular, what people kind of notice about them is where their films take place, right? The setting of those films become a character in and of themselves. For example, No Country for Old Men, the vastness of Texas. Fargo, the barrenness of winter in the upper Midwest. There's these other kinds of examples. Los Angeles. When you think of noir, you think of LA. You also think of San Francisco, but you think of Los Angeles. But really, when you think about the Big Lebowski and you think about the characters, what the world thinks of Los Angeles is, that town's filled with a bunch of phonies. And if you look at the Big Lebowski, there are a lot of phonies, right? The nihilists are phonies. JL or the Big Lebowski, he's a phony. He doesn't even own anything. Jackie Treehorn, the pornographer, just some gigantic pervert who's always drawing, men with penises, can't really think straight. Bunny is some airhead who might have or might not have kidnapped herself. You have the sheriff in Malibu. Oh boy, do I love that little dig at Malibu and how crazy rednecky Malibu can be. And let's not forget the overarching hatred of the Eagles that's in there. But it's a very LA film, right? But the dude is, here you go. You want to see down home real people in Los Angeles? They do exist. And maybe what they're trying to say is there are more people like the dude. Look at the word dude. Dude is mostly a Southern California, Western California term. And there's some kind of essence there about the setting of Los Angeles. And I'm just kind of curious, taking it to a philosophical level, I think the answer is yes, but do you think it was purposeful it was in Los Angeles? And do you think, what were the Coen brothers trying to say about Los Angeles?
What a great question. I think there's so many directions that you could take this in. The first thing first of all, let me register a note of agreement that yes, I think one of the things they do want to do here, and it's something they do from time to time in their work, is to take a place that we have stereotyped ideas of and say, but you know what, there are ordinary people here as well. Not everyone fits those silly stereotypes. And I think that especially here, and this is part of what they're doing with genre, they're always playing with genre, taking what's essentially a film noir structure or a detective novel structure. It's important to say that Big Lebowski, in as much as it has a single sort of predecessor that they're paying homage to or whatever, it would be The Big Sleep, and then a little more generally to Raymond Chandler's work. Taking that sort of structure and in many ways some of the visual accoutrement and so on of that, but not all of them, and then placing at the center, in place of the Philip Marlowe character, the hard-boiled private eye, who's seen it all and kind of can't be reached emotionally, is a little elusive, whatever. Placing the dude, who again is anything but hard-boiled, who is open, soft in a way, emotionally vulnerable, etc., and also just kind of confused a lot of the time, or at least apparently confused, not at all, I think, cynical, is such an interesting way to remind us that if you really found a noir story in LA, if you really went to see what real detectives were doing and real criminals were doing and real people were doing, it wouldn't look like it does in the books. Real people, here's a real guy who in his own way is extremely interesting, who gets drawn into this other kind of plot. He doesn't make the plot. He doesn't really choose to enter for the most part. Other people come after him. And time and again, of course, in the film, other people come to the dude and they move him around. They make him go places. A lot of the time, it's not the dude choosing to go anywhere. They love to mix genres anyway, but they especially do it here. They're not mixing genres. They're mixing things pulled from all sorts of sources. And I think that's one of the sources of fun for them. And I think maybe LA could be chosen in part because it's such a natural place for that. That's what LA is. It's not a natural city in a way. It's a created city. It's a combination of all sorts of things that shouldn't really go together. It's kind of fascinating. It's a little like Las Vegas, except Las Vegas was done in a more deliberate way, whereas LA happened in a more kind of spontaneous way. As inauthentic as it is, or as many inauthentic elements as it contains, there's something very authentically American about LA, I think precisely for that reason. The other thing I might want to mention here is that if I think about their interest in place, that is very often connected with an interest in how people talk. And so from each film, from one film to the next, Coen Brothers characters always talk funny in some way, but they talk the way they do because of the place that they're from. But of course, in LA, nobody's really from LA. Everybody's from somewhere else. And so The Big Lebowski is in many ways, it's a movie about so many things. It's a movie about multi-languages, all sorts of people speaking in different languages, and as a result, speaking past each other a lot of the time. And at the center of this, again, you have the dude. How does the dude speak? Well, he's very casual. He's very sort of post-60s. He's very kind of somebody who seems a little high, or, got really high last night and is coming down today, whatever it is. And then he does this sort of mirroring or vacuum thing where he sucks up language from other people around him and then repeats it later on, which also, as Peter Fossel would say, is also a reflection of the repetitive nature of bowling and so on. And I think of maybe some of the things this movie wants to say about time. But I think that the collision of so many different types of language and ways of speaking is another thing that Coens are often interested in. And here, by setting a movie in LA in this kind of landscape, they get to take that kind of as far as they possibly can and really play with it.
It was interesting. The time setting of this film was in the early 1990s, right? It was around the first Gulf War. I haven't really been able to kind of figure out the significance of that time period other than, the fall of the Soviet Union. It was a new world order. I'm trying to put something together there, but I was never really able to kind of figure that part out. Do you have any idea why it was set at that particular time period?
I don't feel like I have a conclusive answer, and it's something I've talked about. It is, if I think of the films that go, the Coen films up to that time, I think it's the most recent one. I mean, I guess Blood Simple was essentially set in the present, but the present would have been the early 80s because that's when it was made. So Lebowski comes out in 97, right, or 98, and it was set in 91. So it's historical still, as all their films basically are, other than Blood Simple, but very recent history in this case. I do have a sense, in terms of, again, what the film is saying about time and the repetitiveness of bowling, the repetitiveness of all sports, perhaps, but especially bowling more than any other. Maybe.
I'm noticing you're correcting yourself because you're talking to a passionate bowler, so thank you. I appreciate
No, I want to give bowling due credit. I think it's a really fun sport. So, in terms of that repetitiveness, I think they're doing something here they do in other films as well. They certainly do it in Hudsucker Proxy, which is there's these two competing notions of time, and both of them seem to be true in some sense. There's the linear conception, and then there's the cyclical conception. And so one of the really deep questions that they're asking, and I want to emphasize that it is a question, it's not something they're expressing a view on, is which one of these is correct, or how can it be that both of them in some sense are correct, and what does that mean? Because on the one hand, there is certainly an idea of progress in some of their films and history moving forward, and yet it seems that for them, as history moves forward, we humans just keep finding ourselves in the same situations over and over. We never really learn. We never really get better. The evil people never really go away. They just take different forms. So if we think about that, and that connects with many aspects of this film, I think, but in terms of the question that you asked specifically, if I'm thinking about why set in 91, I mean, one of the first things we see, of course, when the dude is in the supermarket is on the TV screen, we see George Bush. We see that we're entering into the Gulf War, the first Gulf War of the early 90s. We soon find out that two of the important characters in this film are veterans. Walter, who is a veteran of Vietnam, and the wealthy Lebowski, who was a veteran of the Korean War. And the dude himself, of course, as a leftover lefty from the 60s, is living a life largely shaped by Vietnam protests and so on. We find out that he was part of the Seattle 7, right, and stuff like that. So I have this sense of repeating cycles. And of course, one of the great ironies of this, which many people have commented on, which the Coens could not possibly have predicted, is that when the dude writes his check, he dates it September 11th, 1991, which is exactly a decade before September 11th, 2001. The film, I think when we watch it now, has this even more poignant sense of repeating historical cycles and being unable to sort of break free of history. But I think that largely this is what this film is about. I mean, the dude really lives outside of time in a way. There's one sense in which it doesn't matter when it's set, because the dude, as we know, doesn't know what day it is. And he forgets to pay the rent. He's not conscious of time. He sort of drifts and floats free. He's on that rug, right, floating above the landscape. He's floating free of time. And yet, of course, like all of us, he has to live in time in some sense. It's going to come and grab him and pull him down and force him to be, in some sense, conscious of history, if only of the parts of history that are physically present for him and are actually acting on him in that moment. And so I think that, this cyclical thing, there's more we can say about it. I think it connects again with the end of the movie, mortality, Donnie's death, stuff like that. But I have the sense anyway that they wanted to start the film with this sense of people whose lives were shaped by this, and yet who kind of now don't quite know how to live because that stuff's not around anymore. It's not the Vietnam War era anymore. It's other stuff's going on. And these people are all a little bit unmoored. They've got their identities that they shaped, and the identities give them a kind of purpose and a role, but they don't quite fit with reality as it is now. And so all of them seem a little bit out of place. And maybe in LA again, because in LA, in some sense, everybody's a little bit out of place.
That's really good, man. That's a really, really, really good answer. I mean, gosh, what a great essay that you wrote. I really enjoyed it. It made me fall in love even more with the dude. It provided me even better thinking and parameters about just what a good person that he is, driven by his sense of humor. His sense of humor is his non-flaw, right? The way he views the world. He could kind of laugh some things off and make a joke of things, joke of the absurdity of things. And truly, the philosophy of the dude himself, dudism, right? There actually is there is a whole, like, if you search dudism, there's like these religions out there and people that truly follow the philosophy. But truly, what I like to think about him is, life's going to happen. And if you got a good sense of humor about it, and if you're open, and if you treat people well, you're probably going to make it out okay. Just like he did. He went through this crazy adventure, but in the end, he made it out okay. And that's probably the best philosophy, that and take it easy. I grew up hearing take it easy from all of my relatives. Like, it's just like it's a phrase. It's like a Mediterranean phrase that we always use. Take it easy, take it easy. And the fact that it was used so much in the Big Lebowski, and I use it to my children, I use it to my dog. It's just such a great philosophy to live by. Troy, this was excellent. I really enjoyed your essay, and I can't wait to hear the episode that you guys put out. I hope some of these questions were kind of helpful to kind of frame some things. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it really was. And I really enjoyed this. It's been really fun to talk about this film, and I have very similar feelings about it. I'm just so fond of it.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad that when you first saw the film and you didn't think that much of it, that you returned to it. I'm glad you did.
Absolutely. So glad too. It was going to get me eventually,
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. If you're enjoying the episode, hit that share button, hit that follow button, let everybody know about this episode, take a screenshot of it, and tag us on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod. Remember to check out the show notes so that you can get Professor Jollimore's work. He's written on poetry, amazing stuff. We want to have him back. You can also support the pod by going to patreon.com/Good is in the Details, linked in the show notes. And when you sign up, you get a shout out from us, extra content, join our book club. Good is in the Details would also like to thank our sponsor, avonmoreinc.com. It's that small bridge business I was telling you about that started in the 90s and grew to an international sensation. If you play bridge, or if any of your friends play bridge, you gotta check out avonmoreinc.com. They have everything for your next bridge party. Smart playing cards, coasters, tallies. You're gonna love it. Let them know Good is in the Details sent you. Okay, until next time, bye.